I study local elections because of, I think they're an essential pathway to achieving greater equality, uh, um, especially for underrepresented communities in our country, in the local region and Bay Area, even around the world, of course. We need to do more to equalize voting along racial and ethnic lines, along age lines, along education lines, right? And I think what we see here is that one of the main reasons for this is that voters, especially younger voters, and especially voters from underrepresented communities, lack information, and especially about some of the complex local rules, the institutions, the candidates, the stakes of an election. And so that is my sort of context for this today. I'm going to talk about one of those local rules, which is ranked choice voting. I think of it as an alternative to what we call plurality election systems. And that means that either one round or two round systems where you don't need a majority of votes necessarily to be elected, right? It used to be called, and it's sometimes called instant runoff voting. When it was adopted in San Francisco, it was called instant runoff voting. The idea was you eliminate the requirements for a runoff election between the top two candidates, and you calculate that using this ranked choice voting process. So either you eliminate a primary election or a runoff election, something like that, and then you have one election, and then you tally the candidates. And the way you do that is by allowing voters to rank order multiple candidate preferences. Changes a ballot to allow voters to rank multiple choices. They only have one vote, of course, but they rank that vote so in, from 1 to 10 or as many as there are candidates. San Francisco used to only allow 3 rankings, right? And then they eliminate then any other primary or runoff elections that used to be used to achieve a majority. So that is the basic idea. It was then what we do is, of course, we allocate those votes in the tabulation process according to those rankings. And first, you count all the first place votes. If there's no majority winner, as we see here, after all the first place votes are counted, there's no majority winner. At that point, you eliminate the last place candidate. This process is repeated until there's one candidate with a majority. Some are used around the world, Australia and Ireland. Some of those have pictures of the candidates on them, which I think is really, really fascinating. And still, though, I think this is complicated. Asking people to rank 10 preferences is hard, right? But as we see here, you then should rank one candidate in each column and only one candidate in each column. You can rank as many as 10 in San Francisco. I believe it's similar in Berkeley, in Oakland, San Leandro. You can only rank one if you desire. So if you rank only one, you rank one. And here's the point. You can rank that one vote anywhere in the 10 slots. One of the rationales that ranked choice voting was sort of talked about to voters in the early 2000s was that runoff elections had lower voter turnout. Fair Vote, the main organization pushing ranked choice voting, would say this. They still say this. It's not true. Runoff elections often have higher voter turnouts, and in San Francisco, 3 of the 4 previous runoff elections had higher turnout than the sort of November general. But nonetheless, so we don't know the answer to that. I see this as a barrier, right? More complexity, that's going to be a barrier to participation. We've seen this throughout the 100 and some odd year history of local elections in the United States, that when we make voting a little bit harder, we should expect some negative consequences. That was my first sort of academic take on this. I'm one of the few scholars who study ranked choice voting who has this point of view. I compare voter turnout in the 7 cities that have used it for mayoral elections to 200 cities that are similar, that are non-ranked choice voting cities. It's sort of a quasi-experiment that I've set up. And this is elections before the adoption of ranked choice voting. These are elections after the adoption of ranked choice voting. And what I found is that turnout declined in the first 2 elections after ranked choice voting, and then it looks like that effect went away. And so I think that supports my hypothesis that the complexity seems to have maybe deterred some voters. And I found that there was lower voter turnout, specifically amongst Black voters and some white voters. That was older research of mine. And what I also found was that it exacerbated some of the turnout disparities, meaning that it advantaged higher education voters and also older voters that were used to the process, I think, a little bit. They were habitual voters. These were all, I think, support for my hypothesis that the complexity, we should see it as a barrier, not an insurmountable barrier, but a barrier nonetheless, right? And then I also have some research showing that there was a higher probability of making a ballot error. I talked about those ballot errors, after the adoption of ranked choice voting in San Francisco. Now, these were small numbers, 1%, but that was quite a bit at the time. That's gone down perhaps since then. And I think the Department of Elections has done a really good job on its voter education process. And I think these new ballots might help this as well. But this is why I'm doing this today, is that we need to inform voters about this and try to sort of you can use idea of helping voters understand this, and not just rely on the Department of Elections, right, as much as they do a good job, right? Really hard to get people engaged, but what I would say is that the more information they have, the better, and the more we sort of give them the help them believe the idea that their vote matters, the better. Like when people feel like, I often hear those same sort of what I call cynical, like my vote doesn't matter, they don't care about me. That perception, especially at the local level, is not true, right? Candidates, and elected officials, they care. They know that re-election is so important, and that if they take positions that are against their constituents, it makes it harder for them to get reelected, right? And at the local level, especially sort of newly mobilizing, maybe, racial ethnic minorities, sort of who may not be fully, incorporated into the political process, that when you feel like I think when you let them know that there are candidates on the ballot that maybe come from their communities, that maybe look like them, or maybe gender or sexual orientation, representation, those sorts of things really matter, right? And so what I try to do is get people to know that their vote matters, even if it's not just the presidential election, especially at the local level, and especially if they want to vote for candidates who are maybe different than the ones who are already winning. That really matters going forward. And it's that attitude of feeling connected to the process that is what gets people to be more likely to vote, and information about the process. So how to get registered and how to vote. So like what I worry about with ranked choice voting is, I don't want people to be like, it's so complex, and here's what you're going to do, and then that's going to turn people off, right? The more information they feel like they need to know, it can turn them off a little bit. So there's a dance I try to play there where, yes, this is more complex, but we can give them information to help them. They can do it. That's the basic idea. We don't know is how will ranked choice voting affect the representation of minority communities. It is an open question. It's the thing I care about the most. I think there's arguments that it might hurt some minority community elected officials.
So, if a voter makes a mistake and if they're receiving their ballot by mail, there's two things that they can do. One, they can get a replacement ballot, but if they just mail it in, as long as we can determine voter intent, we can still accept your ballot even with an error on it. It's going to be manually remade, your ballot, so then that way we can, once we enter it into the computer equipment, it will read properly. But if we can determine voter intent, then we can count your ballot. So, for example, if you mark, now that there is this grid like ballot, if you cross out the candidate that you don't want, and you indicate, no, this is my preference, if we can see and be on board with you that you made distinctive marks letting us know who you are choosing, we can accept that ballot for you, because it is human eyes that are going to be processing these. So if the machine kicks out the ballot because of a marking error, and we can determine the intent, we will remake that ballot for you and process it that way. Or if you want more reassurance and more peace of mind as a voter, you can request replacement ballots if you're doing it by mail, or you're, of course, always welcome to come down in person to take care of that ballot for you. And
Okay.
then, yeah, one other point I wanted to touch on is that, interestingly enough, last year when we had our language access meeting, our LAC committee, one of our speakers said something so eloquently about how they were pitching their information to predominantly the Latino community, uh, and the way that they were educating voters about ranked choice voting was it's really a way to say every candidate matters. So here is your opportunity to rank the candidates in your order of preference because they're all important. And I thought that was a great point that was made, uh, because, as Professor McDaniel had said, some people just want to choose for those affinity aspects, someone that they feel close to, and then give an additional ranking than to someone who's more popular and running on an election.
Ranked choice voting has always been a mystery to me, even now, after all these years that we voted this way. And explaining it to the limited English speaking seniors that my organization serve is really more difficult. But thanks to Eve and Angelica and Catherine at the San Francisco Elections Office, they really do have bilingual workers that are very diligent and very conscientious. So every time, before a major election, before an election, Catherine and her colleagues would actually come to our 14 senior centers and speak again about ranked choice. And if you make a mistake, on your ballot, what do you do? And then how do you make sure, that for our community, for the limited English speakers, they always have a very high sense of what is right. And the seniors will say, I'm afraid to vote because I don't want to make a mistake and make it wrong. So we have to continuously tell them, you have to vote with your heart, and there's no right or wrong. It would just want you to express, how you stand on certain issues and on which candidate that would represent your value. So once we get that through, then it's a lot easier. And when Sandy and I were chit-chatting earlier, I said that many times, my seniors would really come to me and say, I like to vote and I understand maybe half of the ballot measures, but I really don't know whether I should vote yes or no. Sometimes these ballots are written in a way that's very tricky as well. So at times like these, I would say, if you really want to skip certain ballots that you're not comfortable of voting on, then just don't vote on it, but make sure that you express your opinion on the candidates that you value the most, and then on issues that make the most sense to you. So don't just give up not voting at all because one or two questions, might stop you right there. So I hope that would also increase our voters' participation. I think just as background, I think San Francisco passed our language access ordinance sometime in 2001. And I think they amended and strengthened this language access ordinance in 2015 again, making it actually much stronger and more protection for our limited English speakers. And I think since that time, you all know that our ballot already is in English, Spanish, and Chinese, and Tagalog, right, Filipino language. But if you actually ask the election officer to help you with other language, like even Burmese, Vietnamese, Korean, right, Japanese, Eve, all these languages are also available. There are some ballots that they could mail to you if you request for this assistance. And I think there's a lot of nonprofit organizations stand ready to help our limited English speakers to understand the ballots, right, of what the ballots actually mean. We cannot ask people how to vote, but we could definitely encourage them to find sources for the information. So like, for example, at Self-Help, we always actually invite the League of Women Voters to do a forum in some of our senior centers, like we're doing one today for the San Mateo seniors, so that seniors could actually get the run of the ballots as well as the candidates, and then ask questions from neutral sources. So I think that's how we try to really encourage a lot of our seniors and a lot of our Chinese-speaking community to register to vote, and also to remember to vote on the election day. About 10 years ago, I walked around to all the senior centers asking how many are registered voters, right? Just by show of hand. Usually very few hands will be raised. But in about 10, 15 years, now I walk into my senior centers and I would have to say a majority of our seniors' hands would be raised. So that means that in the past 10, 15 years with the language access help, ballot in their own language, I did think that now, I think that the Chinese and Asian voters is a critical block for the past many elections. I think particularly when we have candidates that represent our community, right? Speak the language, have our culture. And I think those are what Professor mentioned as popular candidates, right? Because they do go around and meet up with the community. So it kind of drums up the voting interest as well. A lot of our community really comes from background that politics is not good, right? If I get involved in politics, I'll be either persecuted or put in jail, or like something terrible is going to happen to me and my family. So when it comes to expressing a political view, they're actually quite secretive and not wanting to share, what they think really in here. So we actually have to do quite a bit in raising the awareness of how's the funding that comes to our organization that continue to serve the nutritious and the hot meals, right, at our senior centers. How do we do citizenship classes if we don't get federal funding to support immigration and citizenship work? Things like that. So we backtrack a little bit and start with civic kind of education and engagement. We actually take seniors to attend city hall meetings, either budget meetings or when certain issues involving affordable housing, transportation, right, social services, we actually bring them down to city hall, or even in the district supervisors meetings. We actually encourage and actually facilitate our seniors to go and express their views directly to the legislators. So that opens up, the more frank discussion. I always have the question of why Jane Kim came so close, with Mark Leno, but never the votes got enough to win the either candidates, because they were pairing up, right, for their campaign. So when a few years ago, when the candidates start to pair up and say, you could support me, but you could also support my second choice. So that seems to work with our community. And they feel that, they're not locked into one candidate, but then there's now a little bit of a more collective. Maybe that might help Sandy to talk to some of your friends. And if they don't want to share who they are supporting, we said that's fine too, as long as they go and vote.